Our next discussion or talk, is on Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. So welcome, Jean. We don't hear you yet, Jean. We hope you're there.
How's that?
That is much better.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Let me say thank you for Vikesh's presentation. And also, basically, we're going to be saying the same thing that he said from a different perspective. We must confess that everything we say about Patanjali today is just based on our rendition of understanding based on Theosophy. And so it may be a little off, it may be a little close. The other thing that we're trying to do in this portion is to demonstrate the practicality of Patanjali, the mystical and occult side of it, and also to present for the Theosophical student elements of the Theosophical teaching that are inherent within this particular path. So the beginning portion has to be an understanding of the framework in which we are going to present the Patanjali's yoga aphorisms. And that framework is spoken of as 25 tattvas, or sometimes 26, depending upon how we look at it. But for those that are theosophically driven, we can see in this slide in outline form, page 200 of the Secret Doctrine. If we start from the bottom of the Tamatras, we will see that the archetypal, as she says, the creative, the formative, and the gross are inherent within all of these. We then move to that kind of fifth plane having to do with the spiritual ego and mind and the ray. And then we're moving to the Buddhic and its relation to the sattva, rajasic, and tamasic elements of Prakriti in equilibrium as well as disequilibrium. And then we're looking at that Purushic or Atmic aspect of this. And so when we're looking at this practically, we can see that we are trying to understand our place in cosmos. We can look at this macrocosmically or from a cosmological perspective, or we can look at this microcosmically. And that brings us to another point, that most folks think of Patanjali as a book on yoga. From a theosophical perspective, as we go through the four padas, or the four sutras, or the four characteristic books of aphorisms, of which there are 195 in total, you will find that we are looking at sciences upon sciences. There is knowledge inherent in the aphorisms. There is morals and ethics inherent in the aphorisms. There is psychological discipline inherent in the aphorisms. There is embryology inherent in the aphorisms. There is the process of death, dying, release, and return inherent in those aphorisms. There is the nature of karma and its actions and how it functions in those aphorisms. And there is a depiction of the mind field or the monastic principle in and of itself in those aphorisms, as well as more. And so we have to also mention that as we are talking about Raja Yoga, we are focusing primarily on the role of consciousness in its diluted aspects, moving towards its purified aspects. And again, that was brought out in our talk on the Bhagavad Gita that we just heard. And so Patanjali in book 1 begins with 3 aphorisms that embrace the entire 195. The first book that runs about 55, 56 aphorisms is called Concentration or Samadhipata. And the first aphorism announces that we will be talking about yoga. The second announces that yoga is about hindering the modifications of the mind and or the thinking principle. And the third aphorism tells us what that end goal is in stages, that perfection of vision that is devoid of content obstructing its view as it pierces through all of life, supports life, and is the repository as well as the cause of all of life. So Patanjali begins by telling us that, let me add, for those that have the book, open it up. We can walk through this together, or any rendition, so that you may have some reference points that bring you back to what we're talking about in your own studies. But again, the modifications are spoken of as 5 in nature, and these can be seen as categories of consciousness: correct cognition, or the science of relativity, how all things are relative in the universe in their correct measurement and understanding. The second, misconception, or the errors that we superimpose and inflict upon truth, which is underlying. The third has to do with fancy, or the idea of conceptualization, i.e., how we use names and words to cut out or carve out entities in the world that don't exist, such like tables. So tables have no inherent existence, and yet when we manipulate matter and we call it an object, we give it a name, and then we love that particular object, or we get caught up in it. The next category has to do with sleep. And as was mentioned in the previous talk, we are talking about moving through all of those states consciously, reflectively, and with full awareness: waking, sleeping, dreaming, deep sleep, and those states that exist beyond that. And so when Patanjali is telling us about these modifications, the last of which is memory, and memory is soul memory as well, which implies the operation of the skandhas and the samskaras inherent within the mind field itself. All of those are modifications that have to be mastered by the true awareness. Patanjali then goes through and tells us that exercise and dispassion on every level, on every plane, in multiple ways, applied to our physical nature, our mental nature, and our moral nature, is something that we are constantly engaged in. Dispassion is that neti, doing what we do in terms of our duty, but not getting caught up in, not being addicted to any of this. And so when we are beginning to work consciously every day in our practical life, paying attention to what we do, as well as looking for the truth which underlies all of these things, it is constantly exercise and dispassion that allows for a clarity of vision and discernment that is free of the emotional entanglements that he calls the obstructions. But the next part, after we learn that we can hinder these modifications and that we have to exercise our efforts and dispassion, has to do with a grouping of the different samadhis, or the different levels of consciousness that the practitioner can and must attain, and the clarity and wisdom that is inherent within those. Judge in his Patanjali renditions calls them argumentative and non-argumentative, deliberative and non-deliberative, and then the beatific and the egoic. And that egoic can reflect the Buddhic principle and or only the ahamkaric or manasic principle. It depends. And then Patanjali tells us about abstract meditation. And if we can't do that, he tells us about meditating on Ishvara and what that means as that state of consciousness that supports relativity but exists independent of our time and space. And so if we are working with these constantly, we are piercing in everything that we do. From a practical side, we are learning how to exercise our attention, our concentration, our decision making. From a mystical side, we are looking to develop the ability to pierce through those layers and those planes in terms of discrimination, clarity, and understanding the continuity of flow from the gross to the utmost subtle and ultimate. And as book one goes on, after we learn the topography that we have to begin to move through, he speaks about the obstacles that were mentioned in the Gita talk that has to do with laziness and with stupor and with addiction to senses and with carelessness and with the inability to hold correct views and understandings and with the inability to achieve abstract and subtle states of consciousness in our pursuits, both while we wake and live, as well as while we sit for meditation. And once we begin to do this, we begin to overcome the obstacles and focus on minimizing the distractions, i.e., mentally in our minds. And Patanjali provides us with a series of things that we can focus on or meditate on to achieve steadiness of mind, one-pointedness of mind. And the goal, he tells us, is to achieve that one-pointedness of mind that allows us to understand everything from the atomic to the infinite. And in fact, what he tells us is that when we can achieve that Ishwaric state of consciousness, that is a state of infinite omniscience that exists in every human soul in germ form. And this is how we can also think of Patanjali's yoga aphorisms as the germs of all of the sciences that pertain to our existence. Part two is about means, the sadhana pada. And we begin this one with a quote that was mentioned last week, but is the heart of the entire second chapter. Soul is the perceiver, is assuredly vision itself, pure, simple, unmodified, and looks directly upon ideas. The background here indicates the quote from HPB on page 277 of the Secret Doctrine, where she speaks about the omniscience of intelligence that is inherent within the universe itself, that thrills through every atom and every particle. And when we recognize this diffuse omniscience coming together as its own sun, that sun then becomes the logoic center through which that force that we can call Phalhatic takes the ideas and the images that are inherent within that omniscience and impresses them upon, if you remember the chart, Prakriti, as the laws that are inherent in nature that then form and condition the remaining part of the downward journey. And so the soul plays that integral part. But to help us get through that, we've got two sections here. All of the things that we can do to purify our minds, our bodies, our souls, our consciousness. And on the other side, the tools that we are using. And these you can read in your leisure. But again, Patanjali begins book 2 with purifying ourselves by muttering, mortification, and resignation, i.e., keeping our minds, our words, our thoughts pure and focused on resignation to the supreme goal. The afflictions are those things that were mentioned again in the Gita chapter that have to do with ignorance in all of its forms on each of its levels, egotism on all of its levels, in each of its forms. And if we remember that sun in the beginning, that is a representation of that Purushic light, it actually, if we keep the next slide that comes up in mind, centers itself on 7 different planes in 7 different ways through 7 different vehicles, all of which are pure awareness obscured by the nature of the plane, the nature of the vehicles, the nature of the sheaths, as was mentioned, etc. But book 2 takes us through a coherent understanding of how we eliminate those afflictions. The ignorance, the egoism, the desire, the hatred or the avoidance, and the clinging to or fear of death, dying, etc. All of those are afflictions that obscure the view, not only of us in our practical life every day, our ignorance, sticking to ourselves, what we like, and hating everything else, and being afraid of death, being afraid of dying, etc., etc. All of that has to go. All of that has to be trained, purified, and disciplined. And Patanjali then says when we can do that, we can reach the perfection of spiritual cultivation that allows us to see all mundane existence really as a vexation and a hindrance because we are so centered on understanding and acknowledging the true nature of what this world of Prakriti represents. And then we move into a section that says the perfection of knowledge or discrimination is of a 7-fold nature. And Judge walks us through 4 of those, the other 3 having to do with the monastic principle itself, the gunas, resolving or being reabsorbed back into the Prakriti, and the purification and perfection of that Prakriti such that it becomes a mirror only that reflects the truth of the Atmic or Purushic nature of our being. Once we are working towards that, we recognize that conjunction as the key point of book 2 of the Purushic light with the organ of thought through the vehicles is what ties us to the universe. And once we are caught in the universe, ignorance takes its part and we are deluded by Maya. We get caught up in the gunas, and then we miss the calling of what the true purpose of incarnation is about. And we get caught up in the afflictions, and the afflictions then become the causes for karma. The Hindus have a wheel of life that they look at: happiness and sadness, grief and loss, gain and loss, the virtues and the vices, all of which are dialectic and opposites in a sense that keep us spinning on this wheel of life that we have to learn to disengage ourselves from. And the way that we do that is through the 8 limbs of yoga that are mentioned, that have to do with how we interpret them. But the first 2 are the golden means of morals and ethics. And Judge talks about those as the forbearance and the resignations that have to do with not killing, not stealing, not lying, continence, not coveting, the ability to engage in the mortifications and the mutterings or the tapas and the japas, the ability to understand what the perfection of body and mind is in terms of the perfection as it relates to the perfect discrimination of that which is the goal of the effort or the Purushic state. And book 2 brings us down to the part where we have achieved what they call pratyahara. He talks about the realm of breath as pertaining to the inner circulation of the winds or the airs, or however we want to talk about those. And Judge tells us that that's about the astral anatomy, it's about the astral winds, and it's about those pranas. The right side of this, again, just reinforces all of the things that we have to practice. The attention, the concentration, the steadfastness, the getting rid of distractions, the repetition and reflection of spiritual ideas in our mind, the faith, the energy, the intentness, the benevolence, the tenderness, the complacency, the disregard for virtue or vice, happiness or sadness, which brings us to the voices statement of Viraga, that perfect indifference to pleasure and pain that allows us to conquer illusion and perceive truth. And so when we are integrating all of these things into our life, whether from a practical point of view of cleaning up our minds and being moral individuals, or doing that in addition to pursuing the deeper paths in meditation, it's all converging and leading to one thing. Now, book 3 has different names. Some people call it powers. Judge did not call it anything at all. And some talk about supreme powers. I like to think of book 3 as the book of science. And I think of it as the book of science because if you're looking at this table, these are different ways of looking at the same thing, talking about the same thing, all of which are inherent within the overall framework that we spoke about at the beginning. And the divisions, for instance, of the universe into the 16 diverse, the 6 non-diverse, the once resolvable or Mahat or Ahamkara being resolved with Buddhi into Prakriti, and then Prakriti as the non-resolvable, again, give us the framework that everything we're talking about in book 3 has to do with the entire range of our being, the entire range macrocosmically of the evolutionary process, the involutionary process, and the awakening process, and what it is that goes through that as an egoic light that centers itself in different phases of those planes and establishes itself as a working consciousness that perceives actively those elements and the contents, or the word that is often used, samadhis, or the knowledges that are contained in those states of consciousness on those planes. And so if we look at, again, Judge's rendition here, he had argumentative, non-argumentative, deliberative, non-deliberative, beatific, egoism, and these are two aspects of one, and then Ashmita, or pure Buddhic nessness. We like to think of it as ness because it doesn't have an I. It is a pure presence, and yet it is omniscient and intelligible in terms of how it grasps knowledge. HPB talks about this particular element in the Beacon Light of Truth as a Buddhic instinct and intuition that is able to capture and understand many, many aspects of the world. And so on the left-hand side, we have these samadhis as they are named. And again, the purpose is going from the gross or the world of external senses and organs into the subtle with the winds and the shis and the chakras, etc., into the element of mind and the rudiments or ahamkara and the tamatras. I have here 5 and 7 because theosophically we think of 7 that then become different vibratory aspects that create all of the diversity of the world. And then these being the guṇic aspects of Prakriti. And those that are scientifically aligned may find those 3 gluons, the up quirks, the down quirks, the charms, the strange, and the top and bottom, very similar to those gunas at that state, because from that state we can determine and derive not only the nuclear particles, but the atomic particles, and then the molecular particles, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So Patanjali was part of that eternal knowing of how from Prakriti and resolving Prakriti into its nature, we can get beyond that plane of ignorance that is represented by Prakriti. And in book 3, I hope I've got about 5 minutes left. In book 3, we also have, when you break it down into abilities, the ability to know the elements, the ability to understand the senses and their operations, the ability to hinder those, the ability to understand the subtle winds that have to do with not only the geological earth winds, as we speak of them, the psychophysiological astral winds within the being, but also the monastic winds that HPB speaks about that pertain to how mind itself operates. And so we also have the range of astrology from symbolically the earth to the moon to the sun to the pole star to the Brahmarandra, or the entire fixed zodiac and what's beyond that as it relates to cosmology. We also have within book 3 the ability to recognize how the soul seats itself in the body, what that connection is, and how to use that connection to disengage and or engage. And when we learn that, we are then in a position to work with others that are along this path in terms of the ability to help them sharpen up their skills, etc. Book 4, we just move into the summation of everything in books 3, 2, and 1. And we just call this the night of Prakriti, because what we are trying to work towards is the dawn of the Purushic light, or that awareness. And believe it or not, in book 4, we have a complete dedication to the operation of the mind, the monastic principle, the karmas and how they operate, the nature of the I-ness, the whole world of delusions and illusions. And so when we are at a point where, as it says, we can appreciate the Dharmakaya nature of the universe, the Dharma mega path and knowledge, and we become dispassionate to that, we can reach a point where we are fully aware of that Purushic light on our return. We can join with it. And yet, as we end this portion, we would like to end it with something from the Great Master's letter, because it goes with this slide. Isolation and return, fully aware of all things Prakriti, fully awoken to all states of consciousness, living in the Buddhi manas of one's nature for the Kuan Yin service and benefit of all of life. And that last quote from the Great Master's letter is, "It is not the individual and determined purpose of attaining nirvana, the culmination of all knowledge and absolute wisdom, which is after all only an exalted and glorious selfishness, but the self-sacrificing pursuit of the best means to lead on the right path our neighbors, to cause to benefit by it as many of our fellow creatures as we possibly can, which constitutes the Theosophists." And that brings us to the Kuan Yin service and the need to return so that we can serve. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jean.